Okay, welcome everybody to the Atlanta Friends meeting, our meeting house. I'm Bert Skelley. I'm a member of the meeting, and the Social Concerns Committee of this meeting is posting this for you. And we're so glad to have you here. I'm going to just welcome Ann Mauney, who is the person that's probably done the most to make this event happen. And she's going to introduce our speaker, Medea.
Many thanks to the Social Concerns Committee of the Atlanta Friends meeting for hosting all of us in this beautiful space. I am pleased to introduce Medea Benjamin, who is in Atlanta for a 2-day visit as part of her 50-city tour, speaking about her new book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, co-authored with Nicholas J.S. Davies. Medea Benjamin is both a political activist and author. With an academic background in public health and economics, she worked for a decade with international development agencies before co-founding the fair trade advocacy group Global Exchange in 1988. In 2002, she co-founded Code Pink, the woman-led anti-war organization which played a key role in mobilizing opposition to the Iraq War and continues its peace work today. She has written numerous books, including Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, and Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. Her presentation here today is important because our mainstream media have not provided us with essential context for understanding U.S. foreign policy. Rather than analyzing and questioning official explanations of U.S. policy toward Ukraine and Russia, our major media have almost totally accepted these explanations and acted as megaphones for them. With the escalation we are witnessing, it is even more imperative that we inform ourselves. At this moment, after so much death and suffering, people worldwide, here, in Europe, and especially in the global South, are intensifying their call for an end to this horror. Beyond examining context, Medea Benjamin asks, what is the path to peace? And for those of us in this room, do we have a role to play? We are fortunate that she has brought us together to reflect on this global crisis. Please join me in welcoming Medea Benjamin.
I'm so excited to see a room full of people who want to discuss what's going on and what we can do about it. I'm also excited to be in Atlanta, and I'm glad I'm going to have an opportunity to go over to Cop City and see what's going on there. That has not only become a local issue and a national issue, but I was watching Al Jazeera and France 24 yesterday, and they both talked about Cop City, so it is an international issue. And I think it really relates to this issue because it's all about what kind of societies we're trying to build. And this issue of militarism, it just has to break our hearts. What we've become, how we deal with conflict, whether it's local conflicts, how the police deal with communities, or how our government deals with foreign policy. And it's also about the money to be made from building these weapons of destruction. I worked with some of you, probably your congressperson is Hank Johnson, for some of you. And I've worked with his office for years on this bill to stop the 1033 program, which is the program where the Pentagon gives to local police forces the excess goods that it has. And just try to unpack that for a minute. You know, why does the Pentagon have all this excess stuff? Why should the police department be having military tanks, grenades, assault weapons? And I don't know how it is now. First, when they started the program, it was kind of a use it or lose it type of thing. You had to get out in those tanks and roll them around if you wanted to keep that stuff. But it really shows us how the wars abroad and the wars at home are interconnected, how violence abroad and violence at home is interconnected. And the big problem we have of how to demilitarize our communities, demilitarize our country, and demilitarize the world, because it's obviously not just the United States that has chosen this path. So it is a much, much larger issue that we're dealing with. When it comes to the issue of Ukraine, this is a very hard issue for people who even consider themselves nonviolent, people who've considered themselves even pacifists, people who've grown up in the Quaker tradition. It has divided even that community. And I see a lot of people shaking their heads. And that's why it's so important to talk about this issue. And I don't expect that we will all agree on the analysis I provide. And I hope that we'll have time for respectful discussion. But I have never been in a situation where I have had these vehement disagreements with people I've been working with for decades around trying to stop war. And I was telling Ann, it just happened to me last night, going out to dinner with friends who were staying with us. And the issue of Ukraine came up, and boy, that just blew up the table, ruined the dinner. It was awful. And so it's important that we unpack what's going on. And again, this is from my perspective. And I encourage you, if you can, to get a copy of the book, read it, and pass it on, because we need to educate each other about these issues. So I wanted to say two things to start with. One is we must be coming from a place of trying to stop the pain and suffering of the Ukrainian people. Because every day, people are being killed, people are being wounded, people are being displaced, millions of refugees, and the soldiers from both sides. I mean, these are, for the most part, young people who don't want to be killing each other. Come on. And the families that are losing their loved ones, so much suffering. So the main thing has to be, how do we stop the suffering? And the other really has to be, what is our role in this? This doesn't mean we justify anything that Russia is doing. What Russia is doing is unjustifiable. War is not the answer. Isn't that a Quaker theme? War is not the answer. War is not the answer. So what the Russians are doing cannot be justified. And it is illegal to invade a sovereign nation according to the UN Charter. It's immoral to put civilians in that kind of a position. And nothing that I say today is trying to justify this. I'm trying to give the context. And the context is another adjective that is always used by government officials and by the media when they talk about this war. And that's an adjective I don't agree with. And that's unprovoked. They always say an unprovoked invasion. And that's just not true. This invasion was provoked. This invasion has been provoked now for a long time. This goes back to the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union. It goes back to the time when there were promises made to Gorbachev in 1990, 1991, that the U.S. would not move 1 inch eastward with NATO. That was a promise understood by everybody involved in this. It wasn't a treaty because it would never have been passed in the U.S., but it was an agreement that was made. And in our book, we talk about all the different people who said, do not violate that. And of course it was violated by Democratic President Clinton, by Republican President Bush, violated over and over and over again as more and more countries were incorporated into NATO, and it started to surround Russia. And at the same time, there were machinations by the U.S. government to move Ukraine into the Western orbit and away from Russia. And that was done in many different ways. There were, you might have heard of the National Endowment for Democracy, groups like that get a lot of U.S. government money, our taxpayer money, to create what's called civil society, to create groups that had a pro-Western stance. And our Assistant Secretary of State at the time, and now she's in a similar position, Victoria Nuland, bragged that in 2013 bragged that the U.S. had put $5 billion into Ukraine, creating these kinds of organizations that would be anti-Russian. There was an uprising that happened in 2014. That was an uprising against a government that was democratically elected, but many people were upset with that government because of several things. One, it had close relations with Russia. Two, it was corrupt. And a peaceful demonstration started against that government. And it grew and it grew. And the government used violence against the protesters, and that made more protesters come out. But what happened as that uprising was gathering steam is that it started to be manipulated and taken over. Taken over by right-wing forces, by neo-Nazi forces, by violent forces that turned a peaceful demonstration into a violent rebellion. In the meantime, the U.S. was involved in that as well. In fact, we have pictures of that Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, going out into the crowd and actually giving out sandwiches and cookies to people, encouraging them in their uprising against a democratically elected government. Just imagine if that were the reverse and that happened here. Imagine on January 6th, when there was an uprising against the U.S. government, if Russian officials had come out to hand out sweets and say, go, overthrow your government. There was also a leaked audio tape that showed Victoria Nuland talking to the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine, deciding how to restructure that government, who is going to be the next head of government, who is going to be on the inside circle, who is going to be on the outside. These were two U.S. officials deciding what was going to happen to the Ukrainian government. So talk about internal interference in other countries' affairs. We will find out much more as the years go by, and through Freedom of Information Act requests, we will learn the extent of the U.S. involvement in that uprising that turned into a coup. And I'm sure it will be remarkable how much the U.S. was involved in deciding what would happen to the Ukrainian government. And so here we have two things: the violation and the eastward expansion of NATO, the interference in the internal affairs. So that coup turned into a new government coming to power, not having been elected. 51% of people, according to a Gallup poll, said they didn't consider the new government legitimate. And yet that was the new government, and they started immediately enacting laws that went against the Russian-speaking part of the Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukraine. As a result of that, in those areas in the eastern part of the country that are majority Russian, there was a breakaway republic, two breakaway republics, Donetsk and Luhansk. And it started a civil war. And as that civil war developed, thousands of people were getting killed. And so a year later, there was a successful negotiation called the Minsk Agreements to stop the violence. And over 1,000 monitors came in, mostly from European countries, to monitor the border in Donetsk and to try to stop that violence. Well, there was a political part of that agreement as well, that within the first year, there were supposed to be elections in the Donbass so they could decide for themselves. And there was supposed to be a change in the Constitution giving that area autonomy within the state of Ukraine. That never happened. That was the part that Ukrainian government was supposed to enact and never did it. Why didn't they do it? Because any time a president, and this is true of Zelensky, who came in with a promise to be a peace president, to make peace in the Donbass, anytime they tried to do it, there was a reaction from the right-wing nationalists who said, no way, we won't allow you to do that. In fact, they threatened Zelensky would be hanging from a tree if he tried to give autonomy to the Donbass region. And so it was never instituted, and instead these agreements, year after year, went by without having a real solution. In the meantime, what we heard just about 6 weeks ago in two different interviews, one by the head of Germany at that time, Angela Merkel, and one by the head of France at that time, Francois Hollande, basically saying, we never intended for those agreements to be implemented. What we wanted was to buy time to be able to arm Ukraine. And so the weapons started flowing in. It's not a new thing to be sending weapons into Ukraine. In fact, Obama was already sending weapons into Ukraine in 2014. Trump came in and all gloves were off. Instead of just defensive weapons, they were offensive weapons, pouring weapons into Ukraine. And so we get to the point where it's a boiling pot. This is not new. And when the Russians were asking the US and NATO to sit down and negotiate this, saying that the situation was getting desperate, this was recent, this was back in December 2021, and put forward a plan for discussion, the US said no, and NATO said no. And so the Russians kept adding troops along the border and took the horrible, mistaken path of invading. Now, could they have done something else? Of course. There were many other things that the Russians could have and should have done instead of invading. But I wanted to give you some of that background to understand why the invasion took place. After the invasion took place, then we saw that the Russians, we suppose, thought they could easily come in and take over the whole country, weren't able to do that, had some crushing defeats, have now had to pull back, but still control 20% of the country. In the meantime, it seems that as wars go, you never know what's going to happen. Sometimes there's a victory on the Ukrainian side, sometimes there's a victory on the Russian side. Right now, you might be hearing about Bakhmut, which is the latest area where the conflict is happening, and it looks like the Russians are about to take that. But in general, despite what you might be hearing in the media, what the generals in the US, behind the scenes, and in Europe are saying is that there is pretty much a stalemate. That it doesn't look like there's going to be a chance for either side to get a complete victory. Now, what is a complete victory? Because that's a really important question that we don't really know the answer to. Because right now, on the Ukrainian side, they say a complete victory is getting rid of everything that Russia has taken. All of the Donbass and Crimea. Now, Crimea, and maybe in the discussion part we could go into it more because Crimea is critical. But just a quick overview, Crimea is an area that was part of Russia for 200 years. Crimea is an area that is majority Russian-speaking. Crimea is an area that after the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991, they had a vote in Crimea back in 1991 that they didn't want to be part of Ukraine. So it is also the place where Russia has its critical seaport. It is a place where Putin, that will not give it up without a huge fight. And what does a huge fight mean? I want to quote a German general who was the advisor to Angela Merkel for many years. What he said about Crimea: "This region is as important to the Russians and their Black Sea fleet as the Caribbean or Panama is to the United States, as the South China Sea is to China. For strategic reasons, the Russians cannot get out of there. If they are forced to pull out of the Black Sea region by massive Ukrainian and Western intervention, they would certainly resort to nuclear weapons." This is a former top general advisor to the Chancellor of Germany. So, a victory, according to Zelensky, is to get back Crimea and all of the Donbass. A victory, according to Russia, is to control 4 regions that they have had sham referendums and said they now belong to Russia, and of course to keep Crimea. Those are 2 very polar opposite things. But they are points for negotiations. There are the ways that you sit down and say, this one wants this one wants this, where do we go? Well, many people will say you can't call for negotiations because Putin will not negotiate. That's what I hear over and over and over again. So let's unpack that a little bit. I mentioned in December, before the invasion, how they put forward a set of peace principles that the U.S. disregarded. Then in March, a month after the invasion, there were attempts by the head of Turkey, Erdogan, to bring the sides together and talk. And things were going well, and they came up with a 15-point peace plan. And then Boris Johnson, who was the head of the UK, came and met with Zelensky and said, we don't want you to have a peace plan with Russia. We want you to fight till victory. Don't compromise. We will be there with you. We will be supporting you. And that's also when General Austin, the Secretary of Defense from the United States, went and met with Zelensky. And he has said publicly that we have to use this opportunity to weaken Russia. And so the peace talks broke off. There are people who dispute those facts. They have been said in papers in Turkey, people who were officials who were part of the negotiations, and it also came out in one of the most respected journals in Ukraine. People still dispute it, but there's another example that has come forward in very recent times, and that is from the former Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett. And he said that he was trying to make peace, that he was going from Kyiv to Moscow back and forth, and that both sides were very anxious for a. And then he said, but the West blocked the negotiations. So that is another example we have. When people say you can't negotiate with Putin, I think we should have a very short answer to this. Try. 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 And see what comes out of it and tell us what comes out of it. Now, we do have a Secretary of State in this country. And the Secretary of State is supposed to be our #1 diplomat. You would think our #1 diplomat would be doing everything he could to try to find solutions. Our #1 diplomat, when did he have his first meeting with his counterpart in Russia? A few days ago. A few days ago, after a year of the war. Anyone want to guess how long that meeting was? 10 minutes. A 10-minute meeting in which he said, according to the press, I told Lavrov he had to get his troops out of Ukraine. I mean, this is not diplomacy. You know, this is really making a joke of diplomacy. Diplomacy means sitting down over and over and over again and having long, drawn-out meetings and trying to find one thing that you can work on. There actually has been one thing that the U.S. and Russia have worked on, and that was the release of Brittany Griner. Remember that? And it worked. They have to get together and talk. Now you might say, well, why the U.S. and Russia? This is really between the U.S. and Ukraine. Well, of course it's between the U.S. and Ukraine, but there are other things that the U.S. and Russia have to talk about. They have to talk about arms treaties. The Russians just pulled back on the last arms treaty that there was between the U.S. and Russia. This is after the U.S. has pulled out of two of very important treaties, the ABM Treaty and the INF Treaty. They have to talk about U.S. bases that are surrounding Russia, including in Romania and Poland, 100 miles from Russia's border. They have to talk about U.S. nuclear weapons in 5 European countries. They have to talk about what is it that Russia will have to do to get the sanctions lifted. There's a lot that the U.S. and Russia have to talk about. And of course, Ukraine and Russia have to talk. Now, I want to give a couple of examples showing they have been talking on specific things. For example, there has been a grain deal in place to get wheat and soy and other important grain out of Ukraine and fertilizers out of Russia because it's so critical for the globe. Because people in Africa and the Middle East have been suffering not being able to get access to that grain, and those fertilizers have affected farmers all over the country. So there's been a grain deal to create a land corridor and a sea corridor to get those out. And that has been successful. It's actually been renewed. There have been talks, remember a couple of months ago when it looked like the largest nuclear plant in all of Europe, the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, was going to explode. And imagine the crisis that would have been not only for Ukraine, but for Russia and the whole region. I mean, they're living side by side. And so there were negotiations for the International Atomic Energy Association to come in and be in that plant. And there have been negotiations for prisoner swaps. It's not just Brittany Griner. There have been prisoner swaps between Russia and Ukraine constantly, over one a month, sometimes hundreds of prisoners at one time. And that takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of trust to believe that they're actually going to show up with the prisoners they said they were going to show up with, each side, and it was going to, you were going to have the logistics in place for that to happen. And so that has been happening. And there have also been sending home bodies of fallen soldiers. Both sides have been doing that. So there have been talks. They can talk to each other. But there has to be more of a momentum for them to sit down and talk about how they're going to actually end the war. And so where is that momentum going to come from? I mean, if we had a chance to do a sit-in in front of Putin, you know, I would encourage everybody to do that. And if I lived in Russia, I'm sure I would be in jail for protesting the war.
Yes, you would.
But we're not Russians. We live in this country. And so we have to put the pressure on our government. And our government has so much pressure over the Ukrainian government because U.S. taxpayers are paying all the bills. We're not only paying for the weapons, we're paying for the government to function. In fact, Biden had a press conference the other day and he was saying all we're doing for Ukraine. He even said that we're giving the pensions to the Ukrainian people. And there were a lot of Americans who started saying, oh, I don't get a pension. And you know, we've been told that we just have to keep giving more and more and more, and more weapons. And every weapon is the magic bullet, right? It was the Patriot missiles was going to be the magic bullet, and then it was going to be the HIMARS, and then it was going to be the tanks, and now they're asking for F-16s. And then what is it going to be, troops? And so American people, despite what they hear in the media and what they're hearing from the White House, are starting to really question this. And when I say despite what they're hearing in the media and the White House, I do want to say that the major narrative is the Ukrainians are winning, the Ukrainians are winning, we just have to give them more weapons and they will be victorious. Meaning, I guess, get back all of the Donbass and Crimea. It's never clear. But despite that, Americans are starting to question this. And so we see a new poll that came out by AP that showed that only 48% of Americans were in favor of giving more weapons to Ukraine. And I find that quite remarkable. And polls are showing that have been taken every 2 months that more and more Americans are saying, we have to start negotiations. Well, how is that reflected in our government? There are a lot of talks and a lot of disagreements in the White House, and we can talk about the factions there because, you know, there is one faction, including in the military, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, the #1 military advisor to the president, who has said Ukrainians should seize the moment and go for negotiations. But there are others who say no negotiations until victory. Again, what is victory? So there are disagreements at the national level, and Biden has never talked to Putin. So on the congressional level, you would think if 48% of Americans don't want to keep giving weapons, maybe 48% of Americans would be saying, 48% of Congress would be saying that as well. Well, that ain't the case. Let me tell you, we have two hawkish parties, we have two war parties, we have two parties that are content to keep this war going. Now, on the Republican side, there is a small group of Republican congressional people on the extreme right of the Republican Party that voted against more money, more weapons to Ukraine. And this is something that Donald Trump is using every day in his speeches. In fact, he just gave a speech yesterday to the conservative group called CPAC, and in his speech, he said what he has said many times. Biden is taking us into World War III. I am the only candidate who could stop this from happening. I would pick up the phone and talk to Zelensky, and I would pick up the phone and talk to Putin. I have a good relationship with both of them, and I could find a solution to this. Now, we snicker, we laugh, because we know how Trump, you can't trust a thing he says. But I say that because he gets tremendous applause from his audience when he talks about that, because the American people want to see solutions. Ron DeSantis, nobody I support for president, but he is saying now that he doesn't want to see a blank check going for Ukraine. He has said he doesn't think that Russia is a threat to the U.S. allies in NATO. I mean, that's a quite remarkable thing to say. So you're seeing that they're positioning themselves for the next election. I'm going to end this war, Biden's going to keep it going. And that the Democrats should be very concerned about. There were 30 Democrats in the Progressive Caucus, including Hank Johnson, who signed a letter saying, in addition to all the support that we're giving Ukraine, they didn't say don't give any more weapons. They said, in addition, we should start negotiations. They got so trashed by people in their own party that within 24 hours they withdrew that letter. So now we don't have Democrats speaking out for a rational policy of negotiations. And that is extremely, extremely dangerous. And we have to talk about how we're going to reverse that. How we're going to bring Democrats back into the fold of saying, of course, negotiations is the only way to go. It's the only rational thing to do. And so that's what I want to get into in the discussion with you. But before I wrap this up, I just want to say that sometimes we feel quite alone when we take positions that are not the mainstream position. And especially now when we take positions that can get our friends, our relatives, our partners angry with us. But I want you to understand that the position of calling for peace talks is something that resonates outside the borders of the United States. The people in Europe who are feeling the backlash from the sanctions against Russia, who are feeling the inflation, the high prices of energy, the high prices of groceries, they are out on the streets by the tens of thousands. The people in the global South, who are also feeling the impact of this war, because this is a war that is impacting the entire globe, are saying, despite the pressure from the United States to take sides, we have only one side to take, and that is the side of peace. That's what leaders in the global South are saying. And I want to end by quoting one of those leaders in the global South who just met with Biden less than 2 weeks ago. And that is President Lula from Brazil, because he was pressured by Biden to send weapons to Ukraine, just like countries all over are being pressured by the United States to send weapons to Ukraine. And he said, we are not going to send weapons. He said, what we need instead are interlocutors who will talk to the Russians and tell them the terrible mistake they made by invading Ukraine, and will talk to Zelensky and tell them that he needs to go to the negotiating table now. And he said, we do not want to join this war, we want to end this war. And that is the position that all of us need to take. Closing, I want to open it up because I am really worried about where this is going. I really am worried about this becoming a World War III, about something that could easily happen very soon, which is this going into a NATO country where the U.S. will feel obligated to get involved, where we'll be called upon to send troops there, or where Putin will use a nuclear weapon. Because John F. Kennedy, when he was negotiating with Khrushchev back in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and compromised because they knew that the fate of the world was in their hands, JFK said, if you're in a fight with a nuclear power, never leave them with only two options. One is a humiliating defeat, and the other is the use of a nuclear weapon. And that is exactly where we are pushing Putin right now. And Biden himself has said that Putin needs an off-ramp. Well, let's give him the goddamn off-ramp.
Yes.
Let's find that off-ramp. Let's give the Ukrainians an off-ramp. Let's give ourselves an off-ramp. Everybody needs an off-ramp. And just remember, when you have doubts about anything in this, and there's lots of issues to discuss, just keep one mantra in your head and say it over and over and over again. War is not the answer. War is not the answer. War is not the answer. War is the problem. Thank you.